I guess the good news from my point of view is there's not that much U.S. policy with regard to Israel and Palestine. I mean, Donald Trump would like to make a deal. That's what he does. That's what he thinks he's good at. But there's probably no deal to be had. Trump's friendly to Israel, but doesn't know very much. Doesn't have a deep attachment to Israel, but I think is well disposed to Israel, better disposed than his predecessor. But I don't think he's thought through at all what it would actually take to get to a deal if one could get there with the Palestinians. So there have been these efforts. He sent his son-in-law. He sent his to the Middle East several times. He's got close associates of his as ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, and as the negotiator in the White House, Jason Greenblatt. And they've done a couple of trips. And I think they're being responsible in the sense that they're seeing what is to be done, but they're not trying to force something that can't be forced. I mean, Barack Obama had a real view about the Middle East. It wasn't a view that I agree with, but it was a view informed by a lot of some people who taught him, and I guess way back in college, or who we got to know after college, academics. And it was, I don't know what you'd say it was. It was not anti-Israel, I would say. It was not nearly as anti-Israel as a lot of the academy is, but it was not terribly fond of it. There was no deep fondness for Israel, no instinctive association with Israel that many of his predecessors had, both Democratic and Republican. And I think he saw himself, I don't think he ever quite said this, but I think if you had pushed him hard in 2008, he would have said what his great hope was. It was to be the Harry Truman of the Palestinians. Harry Truman was the American president who presided over the state of Israel and famously said that he felt he was Cyrus, helping the Jews come back to their land. And I think Obama's dream was that he would be the American president who would fulfill the hope of a two-state solution, rectify injustices that were done to the Palestinians, and establish a sort of lasting peace between Israel and a non-terrorist Palestinian state. I don't know that was reasonable. It's not a dream. There's nothing wrong with that dream. In fact, if it could be achieved, it would be, and most people would be very happy with it. And I don't criticize Obama for sort of having that thought that he could perhaps be. He put great importance on the fact that he had grown up a little bit in the Middle East, in a Muslim country, in Indonesia. He wasn't like Bush. He could work with Muslims in particular, and that you see that in the Cairo speech very early on, which is really an extraordinary document worth rereading. Does not correlate much with what happened in the Middle East in the Obama presidency, I would say, but as a document of what he thought he could accomplish and how important he thought he could be in changing what happened in the Middle East, it's really striking. I think it looks very fanciful and really kind of a good lesson to politicians that individuals don't, having one person in office doesn't change a lot of fundamental sociological and cultural and geopolitical facts, but he somehow thought that his very presence could really change things in the Middle East. I suppose it wasn't ridiculous to try that, but it didn't work. I think he had a bit of a grudge is too strong, but animus towards Israel because he thought, especially under Prime Minister Netanyahu, they were not making it easy for him to have a good shot at setting up a Palestinian state, and so there were those clashes with Netanyahu early on. He boasted that there was now going to be distance between the U.S. and Israel. Bush had boasted the opposite. So we tried that experiment. It didn't really go anywhere. I think it wasn't going to go anywhere anyway with Hamas controlling Gaza and with the Palestinians that just really weren't a party for peace there. Maybe Netanyahu didn't always make it as easy as he could have, but I don't think it mattered much and no Israeli prime minister would have made a difference in that circumstance. There was no one who was going to do what the Obama administration thought was necessary for peace, and even if they had, it wouldn't have brought peace, any more than Oslo did. So we're not in that world anymore. I mean, that's a striking, and if you're a pro-Israel, part of the pro-Israel community in the U.S., that's kind of a relief. You get up every day in the Obama administration, and you sort of worried about, well, what are they now going to do to pressure Israel? What are they now going to do to show distance from Israel? What are they now going to do that might, sometimes with good motives, that will still cause expectations to get out of hand, which will then lead to a reaction when something doesn't happen, and it could lead to violence, it could lead to diplomatic problems, it could lead to rifts in the U.S.-Israel relationship. You don't sort of worry about that if you're in the pro-Israel community in the U.S. these days. You don't have, on the other hand, it's not that there's a very ambitious agenda either with respect to Israel. And maybe that's fine. Israel's doing pretty well economically, and honestly, the West Bank's pretty quiet most of the time, and maybe it's not ultimately sustainable the way it is, but it's been sustained a long time, and it can be sustained probably for another few years, and it probably will be sustained for another few years. So, in that respect, there's sort of not that much of a story to tell, I would say, about the Trump administration and Israel with respect to, especially with respect to the Palestinians. In the broader regional circumstance, Trump, of course, sounds the opposite of Obama, bellicose, chest thumping, America first, all this stuff. But in practice, Obama's version of some American retreat from the world, I would say, is not. It's just a different version of retreating than Trump's version. Trump's is America first. It's nationalist. It's somewhat isolationist. Obama's version of America shouldn't do as much was much more internationalist. Let the UN handle these issues. America shouldn't throw its weight around version. But they both agree that America shouldn't do too much, shouldn't get involved in Middle East wars. Nation building's too difficult. Turns out doing anything to stop 500,000 people from being killed in Syria, even that was too difficult. And Trump really hasn't done anything much to reverse what I regard as Obama's terribly failed policies in Syria in particular. That's a real disgrace, and it's a disgrace in U.S. public discourse, and I would say over here too. Not that I've studied it as closely over here, but 500,000 people are dead. And, this was not inevitable. This was not a natural disaster. And it was not happening in a country, incidentally, whatever you think of Rwanda, Burundi, a place that's pretty hard to know how you would intervene. We don't know much about it. That's not true of Syria, every American, John Kerry went to Syria many times. I'm sure the British foreign ministers, Johnson and before, been in Syria. It's not like that's a place they know a lot about. It's right next to other countries that we have a lot of dealings with. To be able to sit and watch that happen and then destabilize neighboring countries and ultimately, incidentally, destabilize Europe, right? What about the refugees? Would we be in? Would other things have happened if Merkel hadn't made the decision the announcement in 2015 that she would take in 1 million refugees? I think if that doesn't happen, Brexit doesn't happen. Probably, honestly, I'm not sure Trump wins without that. And why did that happen? Why is there that crisis? Because of Syria. And why is Turkey moving in the way it is? And why is Lebanon in the situation it's in? So, it really is not just a humanitarian or moral catastrophe, but a real political problem, which no one seems to have any stomach to do much about, honestly. So, there are a few people in Congress, mostly old-fashioned, interventionist Republicans, who, McCain above all, who still speak up about it and say, should we be doing something? A few on the left do too, but the Trump administration has no real stomach for it, and the Obama administration obviously didn't either. So that's that's bad. It's really bad for the world. It's bad for the region. It's caused problems for Israel now. But I said I don't see that Trump is doing anything much different than Obama. Trump is not doing things just as Obama didn't do things. Now maybe it won't, and maybe it's going to sort of peter out and not be quite as disastrous over the next 2-3 years as it has been over the last 2 or 3. It's hard to say, but a lot of that, the consequences already are there. Iran is stronger than ever. I was against the Iran deal, and I think it was unfortunate, and I think Iran hasn't moderated Iranian behavior at all. In fact, it's signaled to the region that Iran is dominant, and Iran has basically got ahead and exerted itself and been not very timid about pursuing its aims in Lebanon and Syria itself and Iraq and really throughout the region. That's not good, I think. Trump hasn't done anything much to stop them there either. He has, I think correctly, triggered this is an internal American thing, but triggered this congressional review, in effect, of the Iran deal, which could lead to a decision to reimpose some sanctions and could lead to breaking up the deal. It's very unclear that the Trump administration, being the Trump administration, it's totally unclear that they've thought through how to do this or that they have any real strategy or plan. I spoke with someone here who's very knowledgeable, close to people in the Foreign Office, who, there's been no serious consultation, I can tell, with allies about how we would go ahead. And some of the allies, I think, especially the French, are open to rethinking aspects of the deal. We were the ones who pushed them into it, actually, in 2015. But again, I have no great confidence in the Trump administration's ability to do this. And so he sounds tough on Iran. If you're sort of a hawk like me and you didn't like the Iran deal, you maybe were heartened for a few days when he was willing to step up and, take on the liberal establishment on Iran, but there's not much follow through. And I do think, and the foreign policy people I trust really believe this strongly, that if you don't confront them on the ground, which doesn't mean U.S. troops, but if you're not serious about Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, the nuclear thing in a way is not the core of the issue. I mean, they're going ahead with their nuclear program one way or the other. Maybe they're slowing down because of the deal. Maybe they're doing stuff in secret. Maybe they're not. But in any case, they seem pretty content to be on the 8-year glide path that the deal puts them on towards basically having nuclear capabilities. That's not what the core, and that's intimidating enough, I think, in the region. But what the real intimidation just comes from their actual exertion of conventional military and other forms of power. So I'm worried about the Middle East, and the Saudis now there seems to be an attempt in Saudi Arabia, and I mean, that's a real black box, so I'm no expert on this, so God knows what's happening there. But it looks to me from the outside like an attempt by the young prince and his under the umbrella of his father to change what really has been a kind of feudal regime with a bunch of related families controlling different parts of the government. I mean, it really is not, when you read histories of, I don't know what century it would be in Europe, I don't know, 16th century, 15th century France, maybe, parts of Shakespearean England, the way I think of it, with these different, Cornwall and, Gloucester, all these characters who have sort of their own, control of their own armies, basically vaguely reporting to some king. It does seem like that's how Saudi Arabia is run, in obviously in a different context, has been run. It sounds like this is an attempt to turn it into something more like a modern monarchy or dictatorship, or authoritarian regime with sort of one center of power. That's, I don't know which is better or worse from the point of view of people living there. He seems kind of pro-Western or pro-modernization, so I think people here are moderately, like in the West, supportive of the prince. I mean, I don't know if they really, one doesn't know if this will work. I'd say history suggests that these transitions are not as easy to pull off as people think, and who knows what kind of instability we'll have there. And generally, I'd say, and I'll just close with this, maybe my general take on the world is it's dangerous and much more, the international world order is more fragile than people think. I mean, we've had a pretty good run for 70, 75 years of a liberal international world order. A lot of things have been problematic, and a lot of governments have made a lot of mistakes, including the U.S., but at the end of the day, if you step back and say, has this been a pretty good 70, 75 years for peace, prosperity, liberty, it's pretty good, a lot better than people thought it would be in 1945, a lot better than the preceding 50 years or 75 years. We don't take enough pride in that, really, in the sense that the U.S. and Britain have been key to those accomplishments, including things like peace in East Asia for, 40, 50 years, which has allowed an amazing economic progress there, which creates some problems for us in terms of competition, cheap labor, Chinese goods and all that. But I mean, it's an unbelievable advancement in terms of just world history to have a couple of billion people basically no longer living on the verge of starvation or total chaos, in the case of China, starvation in the case of India, and living decent lives basically with their chance that their kids will do better. India's better than China in the sense that at least it's democratic, but there too there are questions now. But we just take much too much for granted that this is all kind of going to keep happening and doesn't depend on military strength, diplomatic engagement, certain economic arrangements, including trade, I would say, and more or less free flow or easy flow of capital, which I would defend against all the protectionists and in both parties who now have decided that, I mean, there are prices that are paid for it, but people, again, wildly underestimate not just the economic benefit, but the sort of geostrategic benefit of that. Certainly in America, I think, I mean, the attacks on NAFTA by Trump are totally irresponsible and dangerous. It is really important to the United States to have Mexico be as much as possible a friendly and prosperous and successful country. And that's not something that's inevitable if you look at other countries in the region. Some of them aren't doing so great. Mexico could be Venezuela pretty easily, and it really would not be in our interest to have Mexico be Venezuela. And it's just so, and for what? Because there are industries that have been hurt, there are communities that have had factories move away. We could probably do a better job of job retraining. Those are all legitimate issues, and maybe there's been a little too much sort of blind kind of praise for trade and neoliberalism, as they say, and all that. But on the whole, the praise is actually justified, and it has been good for us, but especially for the hemisphere. NAFTA has, and it's very bad to have an American president who's so negative on it. I would say the same thing about the TPP, the Asia Treaty in Asia, which I don't know that the economic benefits would have been very great at all. Pretty marginal. There's already a heck of a lot of trade with these countries in the U.S., and I'm sure over here you were part of it, really. But again, I mean, think of this: if you're an American ally, if you're Prime Minister Abe in Japan, and you have been urged by the United States to stick your neck out politically and make this trade deal, contrary to the rice farmers and others in Japan. You've done it. You've survived politically. We're on track to deepen the U.S.-Japan relationship, and also the relationship of Japan and the U.S. with other Asian nations, which is very important. It's not as if the Japanese are naturally get along so well with some of their Asian neighbors with whom they have a complicated history. So this is part of a broader attempt to integrate that region and smooth over differences, and a good attempt, really. Backed by both parties, supported by Romney and by Obama in 2012, supported by Republicans in Congress when Obama asked for the fast track authority, it's called, which allows for these deals to go through Congress more quickly. And despite all the partisanship, I think 41 or something Republican senators voted for that in 2015, I think it was. And then if you're Abe and you look up and suddenly Trump's, of course, campaigning against it, and he wins the Republican nomination, a party that's been very strongly free trade since World War II, really. And then Hillary Clinton, who was part of negotiating this treaty, she's under such pressure, or feels under such pressure, from Sanders on the one hand and Trump on the other, that she's against it too. And it really, I think, we in the U.S., it wasn't such a big deal. No one knew what TPP was, honestly. I'm sure people here were paying little attention to it too. But I think if you're actually there in the region, it's like, geez, what is going on? I mean, isn't this kind of a core part of our relationship? And both parties are now flipped to be against this, and they did so rather cavalierly. It's not as if there was any reason for it. It was just that Trump won the nomination, and Hillary thought it would hurt her in the general election. I mean, that's not just, those are important things, but I think it really did shake people's confidence in sort of how reliable is the U.S. in terms of its commitments. The Syria Red Line, I was in Japan in 2013. And again, I hadn't been there in 20 years, and I don't know much about Japan, but I met with Prime Minister Abe, and I mean, he raised the question. This was about 3-4 months after Obama had said Red Line in Syria and then backed off. And he said, what happened there? And I explained it as well as I could, just not having any inside knowledge. And he said, I was just in a meeting with Asian leaders, and they all wonder, is that sort of, what about the commitments to us? And I actually found myself in the slightly bizarre position of defending the Obama administration or explaining that things weren't as bad as you might think about the Obama administration in Japan. And I said, well, I think the U.S.-Japan relationship's different. That's a real treaty. This was kind of a mistake probably President Obama made, and then he had to get out of. I don't approve of what he did, but I don't think you should take this to mean that we're going to walk away from Japan and from our Asian commitments. And we haven't. I mean, I think that was, but it struck me how much, when you study foreign policy in universities or whatever, there's, you study the Middle East, then you study Asia, then you study Europe, as if these are all different parts of the world, which they are in a way, but it's not like people in one part don't see what's happening in another part, and these things don't have repercussions. So I do think the loss of U.S. credibility and the loss of confidence in the U.S. under President Obama was pretty serious, especially in the second term. I mean, people don't distinguish enough between the two terms. The first term was Gates and then Panetta as defense, Hillary as Secretary of State, Petraeus. I mean, it was a more traditional Bill Clinton-like, you might say, foreign policy. Second term really was, well, except for the plot for Iraq in 2011, but surge in Afghanistan, though, so we sent more troops. The second term was really the attempt to get out of everywhere militarily, just staying away from doing anything in Syria to doing anything in Ukraine. I mean, I do think it's not an accident. The red line in Syria, what is that, August 2013, July 2013, and then the failure to come through was Labor Day, right, so September 2013. Putin invades Ukraine February 2014, I think, beginning of 2014. We don't really do anything. Europe doesn't really do anything. China starts testing in South China Sea with the islands. We talk a little bit, don't do anything. I mean, people all over just looked at us and said, well, they're not really going to do much. We don't want to push too hard, but if we do it in a kind of salami slicing way, we can get away with a lot. And I think that's basically... So to be fair to Trump, and I'm not normally very fair to Trump, but he inherited a tough situation. I mean, any president, even my favorite Republican, that would have been Rubio, Senator, would have had a tough time. It was just our defenses had been weakened. Our credibility was not what it once was. A lot of work would have had to have been done, I think, to rebuild U.S. power. But the U.S. remains a very strong country, and it wouldn't have been that hard. With Trump, I think there's further erosion. And for me, and I'll just close with this, the big question that no one knows the answer to, I think, is, how much strain can the system take? I wouldn't say anything terrible is happening yet. I mean, it's not as if, for all of Trump's talk, we're basically following a fairly traditional, kind of fairly incompetent version of a fairly traditional foreign policy, sort of staggering into these, things instead of doing them in a more purposeful way. But McMaster and Mattis and others have kind of kept things from going off the rails, but I just don't know how much, and maybe we'll do this for 3 more years. We'll be here in 2021, and the world will still look kind of the way it does, and NATO will be NATO, and the Middle East will be a mess, and the Saudis will be doing whatever they're doing, and Israel, Palestine will be having their 9,000th, meeting about relieving the checkpoints a little bit, and, the Asian alliance will still be there, and I mean, that in China will be, constrained and not being too irresponsible, and that's possible. I mean, the world, these things have a lot of momentum on their own. We should never underestimate that. But I just don't. You don't know in a way how much stress and strain the system can take, and how much U.S. neglect and U.S. kind of irresponsibility, what it could trigger. And you never know where these things get triggered. That's the other thing, right? And you never know kind of what straw. Just using the cliche, what straw breaks which camel's back, It's sort of like you don't know what part of the world's going to blow up or where something goes wrong. Some nationalist gets elected in Mexico, or something happens in the Baltic states, or, God knows, the Middle East. There are plenty of places things can happen. And again, we're used to things happening, and maybe there'll be another Hezbollah, Israel mini war, and maybe it won't be any more. I mean, it's terrible if you're in the middle of it, but it didn't ultimately have, I guess, dramatic geopolitical effects. Ultimately the world kind of chugged along after those wars in 2006 and afterwards, but I don't know, couldn't spin out of control. Was Iran in a different position? That's right. There are an awful lot of parts of the world that seem to me to be 1 or 2 steps from spinning out of control, which is not a desirable or something, just, position to be in, and not something you can sort of count on, I think, arresting. You sort of worry that we don't really notice until it's a day too late. So that's my fear of America under Trump, which, as I say, is compounded by the preceding 8 years of America under Obama. And but on the other hand, I mean, we are strong, and the liberal order probably has a little more institutional weight and kind of historical heft than maybe people think. So maybe it kind of makes it through the way countries can muddle through, and I feel like we're doing that domestically with Trump. But I'm more worried about the international system. I think that domestically, I'll just close with this. I think the American institutions are pretty strong. So I mean, you can have a pretty bad president, pretty irresponsible president, and separation of powers, federalism, the courts, the media, civil society. We have a pretty huge structure of institutions that probably limit what he can do and limit the damage. But I do feel that that's happened so far. How much damage he's doing to liberal norms and democratic processes and the political culture, that's a more complicated question. But at home, we have all these structures are pretty deeply embedded. So we don't have one bad president and become Venezuela, you know, and you could have a bad prime minister that wouldn't become, you know, Yugoslavia or something, you know. But that's one definition of what it means to be a developed country as opposed to kind of a, let's say, third world country, right? You have structures that are much stronger, but internationally that's trickier. You know, those structures are just by definition less embedded. They're more dependent on sort of particular leadership. There's not really institutionally as much behind them. There's something behind them, but not as much. And so that's why I worry more about foreign policy than domestic policy.